Hey everybody, welcome to BIC Life Podcast. We are so glad you could join us again this month for our April episode. This is where we get to talk about life and faith in Jesus from a Brethren in Christ perspective. And we are again joined by a wonderful guest this month, and we'll get to him in just a moment. For now, I am Ryan Stockton, joined as usual by my buddy Scott McPhee. Scott, how you doing?
You know, I am doing wonderful, Ryan. Thank you.
There are so many adjectives you could have chosen, and you chose wonderful.
Well,
I like
because
that.
you called our guest wonderful, and I thought, well, does that make me something less than wonderful?
Yeah,
I don't know.
You got to be wonderful too. All right. Well, we've talked about the guest a couple of times. We are joined today here by Mr. Chad Frey, a friend of mine going back, back when I was in college is when I first met Chad, and when I first came back into the Brethren in Christ, just about a year and a half ago, as I came in as a pastor at Marsh Creek. Got to reconnect with you, Chad. It's been wonderful to see you again and reconnect after all these years.
Yeah, man, it was great to see you in Kansas, of all places, this summer. We got to catch up a little bit.
Yeah, man. General Assembly, that's the place to be.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
So Chad, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm one of those cradle BICs. You know, we're talking to like an insider group, right? So
yeah.
I'm the guy who went to a big church in utero.
Okay.
So it was one of those things that my entire life, you know, has been Brethren in Christ. And real quick story of my little journey, Manor Brethren in Christ is my home church, always will be my home church. Like, that's just, you know, there's home and there's home, right? That's the home church. John Hawbaker was my pastor then, back in the day. John, you know, dedicated me as a baby. I got baptized there at Manor.
I see him a lot. I see him a lot on the weekly mission prayer calls for Brethren in Christ World Missions. I see him a lot there.
No doubt. And we're going to church together now at Harrisburg BIC. So, you know, years later, it all comes back around, right? I just taught a class on Rooted at Harrisburg BIC, and John was in the class. So he affectionately calls me his teacher now.
Wow, that's wild. But you've got family. We just discovered at the Atlanta Conference General Meeting this past Saturday, we discovered that you've got family at Scott's Church.
Yeah.
Too.
I sure do.
Yeah.
I sure do. So, you know, the Lancaster County thing, a couple fries around, right? You know, but
yeah,
we're in this weird space where people actually refer to a county as their home. Like, I don't know of too many other places. It's like nobody here says I'm from Dauphin County. You know, like, I'm from a entire region like Lancaster County. So yeah, you know,
that's true. I hadn't.
You know, yeah, I've never thought about that. Although I've never officially lived outside of Lancaster County.
Oh, really?
Does that make me a Cradle Lank or something like that?
Cradle Lank. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that people really don't think a lot about is you're kind of in like the epicenter of the entire Northeast. Like, you know, you think about it, just a day trip from DC to Philly, you know, Baltimore's right there, like New York, you know, we're right in there. It's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
County, baby.
Yeah, I've lived in all of those places, but Baltimore, I think, that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So, home of the Ravens. So you won't find me there. So.
Well, yeah, I came from Manor, and then when I went to Messiah, I was a student at Messiah. I actually for 4 years worked as a youth pastor at Dillsburg Brethren in Christ, which was a phenomenal experience. And then after I graduated from Messiah, I came back to Lancaster County area and worked at Millersville Brethren in Christ. And then I did a little quick stint in Peckway Brethren in Christ. I came back to Messiah as a professional and attended McBic. And then when I bought my house in downtown Harrisburg, I transferred membership to HBIC, Harrisburg.
Okay.
Everybody has these cool little acronyms. McBic, which is Mechanicsburg, BIC, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and HBIC. I guess we're RBIC here at Refton.
Yeah. We're MC BIC? MCCC BIC?
Well, you could steal the McBic thing.
Well,
maybe you shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't promote that.
Though. Yeah, I don't know. Mishbic. There you go.
There you go. That's catchy.
That's getting a little. That sounds a little close to a swear word. So I don't know how much I could say that. It sounds like a euphemism. Son of a mishbic.
Just slur it all together and just like.
Oh my.
Oh man, we're going off the rails. It's a good thing we're not officially sponsored by the Brethren in Christ. Yeah, they'd have problems with that.
Maybe. So
Chad, you are at Messiah right now? Are you working at Messiah?
No, I'm actually in a co-working space. I'm in Midtown Harrisburg, which is just a couple blocks from my house. This is a little shout out to Pursuit Co-working Space. Are you familiar with co-working at all?
Yes,
I am.
Yeah, we got a little space in Downingtown, just down the street from me.
Sweet. And I did a little stint down at the Candy Factory. When I'm in town, just need to like pop in. There's a little co-working space in Lancaster. But these little spots are super helpful for folks that are like, nomads a little bit, like when we're jumping all over the place doing things. My office is actually just a block, actually 3 blocks away, right downtown. Right beside my house, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm not I was at Messiah this morning.
Yeah. So are you working there? Do you work at Messiah?
Part-time. This vocational question is like, it's a conundrum, right? I can't even explain it to my parents what I do, right? And I've been in all these jobs that are like unexplainable for lots of right now, I work part-time at Messiah, giving leadership to student fellows in the social sciences and prepping for a conference on housing and neighboring coming up here on August 20th, where we'll bring people together in the community. So many years at Messiah, I was in the world of community engagement. I served as the director of the Agape Center for Service and Learning and did local, national, and international engagement with community partners. Mm-hmm. So my background is this kind of weird 1 foot in higher ed, 1 foot in the community, doing liaison-y kind of things. So now I'm more on the community side, full-time. I have a software company, actually. Kind of a little bizarre twist from being a youth pastor, but as you go, like,
man,
yeah, the software world is really interesting. I'm not a coder. I put teams together. So I use like the gig economy. We do full stack development for custom apps, and I just build teams. I'm a team builder.
Yeah.
And help translate human problems into like, those big word problems in like high school or middle school. Like you take those word problems and you break it down into like a logical kind of like, answer. And then it's a lot of just code switching, talk with different communities of practice, put it in language that my developers will understand. And then, we go for it.
There's people work and translation work, sounds like.
Completely.
Yeah. Wow.
Completely.
Man.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, so some of this work, you were talking about this conference on neighboring, and we'll talk a little bit more about that near the end here, but I want to get into why we brought you here for this conversation specifically. So you wrote on the bicus.org page, which is the main website for the Brethren in Christ. They have a blog there, and posts come up kind of sporadically, sometimes once a month, sometimes they'll come every couple of weeks down the pike. It's kind of irregular, but posts come on up, and a few weeks ago, I saw one pop up from Chad, and I was like, oh, that's cool, great. He wrote a post for the blog. That's great. So, and I found out it was part of another work that you had worked on previously, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about this post. And maybe what got you into like wanting to write about it. Talk to us about the concept of neighboring, just kind of get us familiar with the post here.
Sure. Yeah.
And we will link to the post in the show notes. So I just want to say that real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on ahead, Chad.
Awesome. It's called a zesty mix. And I got into this because I was asked, actually, it was like, what's going on here is the denomination, as you probably know, is gearing up for our 250th birthday. Mm-hmm. And part of that, it's in Project 250 language, and like laying out a strategy towards our birthday are these like core values. And one of them was focused on our demographic realities that are changing around our congregations across the US, and trying to more accurately reflect and respond to those changes. And so in my conversations with Jennifer Lancaster and lots of other folks related to this, neighboring has bubbled up as kind of the word that has been really helpful for me. It doesn't hurt that it's biblical, right? Like when you think about the things that we're put on earth to do, it's really two things: love God and love your neighbor. It's pretty simple what God's will is for us at that general, like high level part. Mm-hmm. How we specifically work that out, for many of us, we're trying to do that in our local congregations. That's our like community work in our specific places, and responding to what's going on around us, as well as hopefully prophetically imagining what the kingdom might look like in our places, which changes the conversation dramatically, right? So hopefully we'll get into that a little bit more, but this zesty mix was an attempt to just give some practical handles to what it means to love our neighbor, and to really try to encourage us to do that, not in some metaphorical, like abstract way, but to take the great commandment literally and start on a little journey here of getting to know the names of the people that live right around you. And as you start to roll up your sleeves and you start to have these conversations, you get a little bit deeper in relationship. You start to understand who they are, where they're coming from, why they do what they do, think the way they think, talk the way they talk, and culturally their background, their history, learn their story. And I think for me anyway, that's helped me be a little bit more empathetic to when they do something I don't like, right? Sometimes your neighbor is like not easy. In worst case, your neighbor is also your enemy. So there's like two sides of the same coin, right? And which that's also biblical. Love your neighbor and love your enemy, and they might be the same people.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's the Good Samaritan, right? Who is my neighbor? The Samaritan, right? He chose an enemy to say they are your neighbor. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is like, bringing up the Good Samaritan, for me anyway, in my life, there was this study at Princeton. You probably heard of it. It's the Good Samaritan study is kind of what they called it. But they took seminarians, and they set it up so that these seminarians had to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan on the other side of campus.
I did hear this. Yeah.
I didn't hear about this.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, go ahead.
They like staged an actor on the way to preach this sermon that you couldn't miss, right? This person was in need of help. And what they were doing was trying to like control the social variables in this study to figure out the motivations behind what's going on will they stop? Will they help? And you know what they found? Like the biggest significant variable for whether or not people would stop and help their neighbor on the way to preaching a sermon about neighboring was whether or not they were late. It was a matter of being busy. Wow. And what they were extrapolated on was, like this factor of busyness, of like the next thing, being late, that pressure is often what stops us from being empathetic, compassionate, actually doing the things that we really believe. And when you start to think about it like that in our Western cultural world of crazy, like, I mean, talk about countercultural stuff. Just stop some of those things for a second and reflect, listen to your neighbor, and your world will start to change.
Yeah. Ryan, that sounds like it ties into with our last episode.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, we were talking Sabbath rest and moments of Sabbath and slowing down and yeah. Oh my gosh. Busyness. That was the determining factor, huh? Being late. Oh goodness. And that just sounds true for me. That's why I'm like, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm kind of reacting with some grimacing and like some because it that hits a little close to home for me. So wow, that is fascinating. So this post was talking about neighboring for you, and this post called Zesty Mix, and you outlined 5 practices, 5 things that Harrisburg Brethren in Christ, the church that you are a part of, is kind of working on. Do you have those 5 in front of you right now? I have them in front of me. So you want me to run through them, or I just want to kind of give people quick hits here.
Sure, I got them here.
Great.
I'll pull them up. Number 1 was just start where you are. So that's the first one. The second one is love people for who they are. The third one is take the great commandment literally. Mm-hmm. Fourth one is work for justice in changing neighborhoods. And the fifth one is keep a prophetic imagination.
Awesome.
So those are the handles, right? Like just to try to help people think about neighboring through that lens.
Yeah. There are some things that I thought were fascinating about each of those. Well, starting with where you are, you wrote being intentional about knowing and interacting with those around you. That's what I think most of us would think about when we think about neighboring is, okay, I need to know the people around me, right? Get more intentional. That seems to be the more on its face obvious step for neighboring intentionally. Loving people for who they are, that sounds also right, but it also sounds hard. Like you wrote here, neighboring is not a church growth tactic that turns people into targets to hit for conversion quotas, nor is it an assimilation scheme to get those around us to become more like us, thinking, believing, and doing the same things we do. Rather, neighboring helps us love people because they are made in the image of God. Like that's the reason. We're not loving people to get them to be more like us, which is, even if it's an unspoken or even consciously thought of, like subconsciously, sometimes I might get frustrated if I am forming a relationship with people and they're just continuing to make these decisions that I really wouldn't, or they continue to treat their children or their spouses inappropriately, or use language and talk about things that I would prefer not to, like, and get frustrated with the fact that they're not changing, they're not becoming more like me. And but to say it as flat out as you do here really hits the mark. We're just loving because they're made in the image of God, and God loves them, and so we must.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I think just backing up real quick to the start where you are.
Yeah,
I think you're spot on, Ryan. That at first blush, that just makes sense. And it's like, you got to start with the people that are literally right around you. But if I were to like problematize this a little bit more, if you will, starting with where you are, neighboring happens in a place. And this is something I really love about it, because it starts to get place-based. These people that are near you or around you are actually in a place that has a history. And part of this, when I'm writing it, I was writing it from the perspective of like Harrisburg, right? This is my place now. That's the place for my congregation. And I'm aware through work of my colleagues and just other really good books that Harrisburg has a history. And it is the way it is because of systems and structures that have created the place that I am now, right? So starting where I am is really kind of backing up to recognizing that the people who are right around me, the place that we're in together, just didn't happen like out of nothing. Like there's a history here, there's a story here, and there's a reason why they are the way they are and the place is the way it is, right? I think some of it is, and I could get into this a lot more when we talk about diversity and things related to like power, because neighboring and hospitality go hand in hand. And there's this interesting guest and host relationship that's super deep. But the gist of it is, in my history and in my cultural background, I have a tendency to like forget about history and just like discover stuff. And it's like, hey, look what I found, and then I start to like just jump into it completely like unaware of what was there before. Does that make sense? So this number one thing, start where you are, like it's intended really to just be that super practical, I can do that. It's also intended to actually get some wheels going about, I wonder why this is the way it is.
Yeah. Well, starting with where you are, that it reminds me, bringing it back to the Good Samaritan again, right? Where the reason why that story was so radical is because of the history, right? He was an enemy. Why was the Samaritan an enemy? Well, you have to know the history to know why it was so. To know why someone, the priest and the Levite would walk around them, right? And the direction they were going, and what could happen if they stopped in the middle of a road, like they could end up like him too. And just knowing the history gives that story the heft that it has. Yeah. And so I think it really can really help us in understanding our neighbors and understanding, why a place is the way it is, right?
Yeah. Like and sometimes there's skeletons in our closet, right? I mean, I'll give you two examples. I grew up in just outside Millersville and Washington Borough area. And farm country, it's absolutely beautiful. And a lot of it continues to be farm country because it's preserved, right? There are programs that are preserving that land. Otherwise, it would have been developed a long time ago. But what was interesting to learn over the years is that there was a indigenous tribe of Indians called the Susquehannock Indians that lived by the river. And that tribe was actually exterminated by the Paxton boys that from County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. And about 5 minutes from my house, in a small little jail, they were actually the remaining Susquehannock Indian tribe was like actually locked up in the jail for their protection. And these guys broke in and actually killed them in the jail. So it's a story, pretty fascinating historical story, and incredibly sad of, a genocide that happened. This tribe was wiped off the face of the earth from this, particular experience. Well, fast forward, I happen to be in Northern Ireland in County Derry. If you're like from the south, you call it Derry. If you're from the north, you call it Londonderry. It's a walled city, and there's a museum there. And I turned the corner in the museum and I saw this exhibit to the Susquehannock Indians and the Paxton boys, telling the story of my hometown, 5 minutes from my house. I'm learning, I'm reading about this in Northern Ireland, right? Of these kind of like sad stories of like, rural indigenous people and history of cultural, cross-cultural connections.
Yeah.
Another story of that is in Harrisburg. I learned why our school district is the way it is. And some of our businesses are the way they are, largely due to federal practices called redlining back in the day, where folks would actually zone cities in desirable and undesirable places based off of where people of color lived and immigrants, and undesirable populations where they did not give funds to build and to develop homes, to develop resources for businesses and things like that. These are clearly documented examples of prejudicial racism in our past and in our history. So all that to say, like, when we start where we are and we start to unpack the places that we're in, yeah, all kinds of things are going to fall off that tree.
Yeah, better watch for what hits us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh man. Well, yeah, so that works really well into your fourth point, working for justice in changing neighborhoods, right? Where you wrote there, for neighboring to be truly transformative, we must take seriously that not only might our neighbors also be our enemies, like we talked about, but that there are powerful systems and structures that have created and continue to sustain and perpetuate injustice, violence, and poverty. So yeah, that's speaking a lot to what you were just talking about there.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, if you're getting the feeling here, if you're listening to this podcast or kind of reading the little article, this is a lot more than just bringing milk and cookies over to the person that moved in next door.
Mm-hmm.
Like, neighboring has that kind of interpersonal relationship with people, but it's also something I'm trying to think about in terms of systems. Like, what does it look like for groups of people, for organizations, and arguably the church as an organism, to relate and neighbor with other organizations and with other groups of people? So it's kind of a two-part thing. It's not just the person to person, but it's groups of people and groups of people.
Yeah.
And when you start to talk about that, you have a history for why people are there, where they are coming from. You start to realize, hey, not everything is always equal. Not everybody is on the same playing field. And so this is why this issue of justice comes up, and really, to get, like, I think it's appropriate to get theological, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, this is
Go for it.
We don't talk a lot about, like, the host in communion, say, like our Catholic brothers and sisters would.
Mm-hmm.
But when we take communion, what's really going on there? Like, we're practicing hospitality in the way that it's supposed to be practiced. And part of that practice is to get right with your neighbor before you take the elements and before you come to the Father and are reconciled and forgiven. That is a really important part of this whole process. So loving God and loving our neighbor are really connected in taking communion on Sunday morning and breaking bread with people throughout the weekday. Those elements of hospitality and experiencing the other is all connected, right? So, little bunny trail, but I think it's connected to justice.
Yeah. It's not something a lot of us typically think of as connecting communion with justice. But when you make justice relational, then it seems to make a whole lot more sense. There are lots of aspects to justice. There's judicial justice, there's legislative justice, but then there's also relational justice. And oftentimes the judicial and legislative flow from when people are working towards relational justice.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And when you think about our own tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, because of our story, we didn't have a whole lot of time to write stuff down because we're, like, running for our lives.
Trying to stay alive. Yeah.
It's like, we're not so much like a creed of people here. But part of what I think is really special about our tradition is that, we do things. We try to practice. Some people call it orthopraxis, right practice, which actually helps us to think more correctly about God and about others. So I think, Ryan, you had asked me a question about, like, does practically neighboring with people help us to actually understand, these things like justice, these things like forgiveness and other things? It's that practice of getting to know your neighbor. It's that practice of getting the messy working for justice stuff out that helps us sometimes think and believe more rightly. We're in kind of a heady culture. I work at Messiah, and I'm surrounded by a community of incredibly cerebrally gifted people, right?
Yeah.
Fortunately, they also have phenomenal hearts and are not afraid to, roll up their sleeves and get busy with their hands
Mm-hmm.
in the work of communities. But I think it's really important that we not only think correctly about God, and believe the right things, but we live them out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a youth pastor, I'd say at some youth retreats, I'm like, hey y'all, what if God didn't want you to believe in him? And their jaws drop and it's like, what are you talking about? Right? It's like, this is heresy 101. What do you mean God doesn't want me to believe in him?
You weren't a youth pastor that long, right?
No, I was bounced. No, I wasn't. But I tried to get it like, okay, but what if God wants you to live in him? There's a sense to like, there's this intellectual exercise that we can do about believing the right things that we can separate from living in and through the Holy Spirit. And I think that was always helpful to recorrect some of that heady stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of times there's a phrase that's running around in my head right now that I've heard a few times, that a lot of times we try to, as Christians and really also just culturally, we try to think our way into acting. Like we need to know first and understand first and all that stuff, and then hopefully the motivation to act will come. But instead, what happens in practicality is we act our way to thinking. Our actions are the way we live, what we do impacts how we then think and what we believe. So it sounds a lot like kind of what you're getting at there.
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, there's a Anabaptist or a Mennonite cliche. It's like, hey, you want to know if I believe in Jesus? Ask my neighbor.
Oh, man.
That's the measure.
Oof. See, and I think that actually gets to one of my questions that I had for you. And it might sound rather circuitous, but I'll explain, I'll connect it. So I'm thinking about our different contexts, right? So you're at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ. That's a fairly urban, now draws people from the urban setting in Harrisburg, but also from suburban settings surrounding. I am in a much more suburban, like definition of suburbia, right? Where I am with the houses and the everything. It's pretty developed and all that jazz, but it's suburbia, right? Scott Refton is a little bit more on the rural side of the spectrum. You're not all full out rural, but like, okay.
Yeah. So, we got farmland right there.
Just on the other side of that wall.
Tractor's probably going by right now.
So when you think about these three contexts, right? That's the urban, the suburban, and the rural. That's what you learn in elementary school, right? And you think about your context there in Harrisburg. And I read this article and I'm like, oh, cool. That sounds great. Working for justice. And there's diversity, elements of diversity included in this and all this. You talk about a zesty mix of people. What if you're not at an urban context? Yeah. And so when that question that you brought up, you want to know if I'm a believer in Jesus, ask my neighbor. I think that gets a lot to how this could look for us individually in different contexts than in an urban setting. Because you can ask the same question in all three of those settings, but how you get your neighbor to come to understand that you are loving them because you are a follower of Jesus and that is important to you. That can all of a sudden, in my mind anyway, it took on a contextualized understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right on.
Yeah. So like in Harrisburg, how have you been neighboring your neighbors? Like what have you been doing specifically in your context?
Yeah.
As Chad.
Okay. Like me personally.
As Chad, but then also as HBIC, I suppose. But yeah,
sure.
Let's go with Chad first.
I'll talk about them both.
Yeah.
So, I moved into the city in downtown Harrisburg. So When I say I'm downtown Harrisburg, I'm a block from the Capitol and a block from the river. So like,
wow.
I'm right smack in it.
Yeah.
And here's what I didn't know moving in. I moved into that space largely because Messiah was starting a Harrisburg Institute right up the block. And I was like intentionally moving in to be near that institute and with our students.
Okay.
For a while, I was like a RD in that space,
Yeah.
but I didn't actually live in the apartments, but I was right down the block. So I moved in and I didn't know a lot about the neighborhood. I came to find out that being where I am, I'm on every parade route. I'm on every protest route. This is an incredibly political city, right? So like, I mean, I'm just around politics all the time.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
Some people are like, oh my gosh. Like, I'll just tell you this, pray for me, right? You heard like the Babylon stories, like, yeah, pray for me. And for our whole congregation, right? We're in this thick. But I think that's dramatically different than Lancaster County, right? And a rural area. And so before people have these rosy visions of like idyllic, farmland and all this like amazing, like, little sustainable world. And it is, don't get me wrong, Lancaster's absolutely gorgeous. You're insulated from a lot of diversity. The systems that are there just don't expose you in the way that Harrisburg does. And some of that is by design. So I think some of these things, like Harrisburg's got its own problems, but so does Lancaster and so does Marsh Creek, and like we all have problems. Yeah. It's not like any one of these contexts is somehow like outside of it. It's just that they're manifesting in different ways. Right. And diversity, like I would say the first thing that's really important because of who I am, I tend to think about diversity I hear that word and I immediately snap to racial diversity. Right. But diversity is all different kinds of things, right? Like culture is all different kinds of things. It's not just the color of our skin. And so as we start to unpack the richness of what we mean by diversity and what we mean by culture, we start to realize, wow, we are all actually in incredibly diverse places. It's just that diversity is very different. And we need to like explore that and dig into that. I think all of us have that work to do and to think about that carefully from our perspectives. It just so happens that when you're in a city, it's like, it's on you. Like you can't not be exposed. You walk out the door and it's there, right? It's in your face. In all of its forms. And that's because you're literally living and sharing walls, sometimes paper thin. People's business in your neighbor actually is your business because you hear it. Like, like the things that are going on, it's just you don't have that buffer, right? And some of that creates incredible community opportunities that you can't have when you're far apart, and you just don't have that kind of chance. Growing up, my closest neighbor was like a quarter mile away, and that was my grandparents. So like it was a very different kind of vibe. It's just so for me in Harrisburg, really practically, it's meant getting to know my neighbors around me. One of my neighbors is a widow. And she has lots of needs. She basic needs. I've been called late at night. She's fallen out of bed and couldn't get back in bed. And so I've had to come over and help her in the dark. Fortunately, she had her phone, but otherwise she would have been there the rest of the night until the nurse came in the morning.
Yeah.
So there, these stories of like abandoned seniors and folks that are living in loneliness,
Yeah.
isolation, like that's my neighbor. And on the other side of me, my neighbor, her name's Fruit, and she's a grandmother, and there's probably 3 generations living in her rental small house. And like the kids come out and I hear them playing like with their Nerf guns and things like that on the sidewalk. And they all know my puppy Everest. So whenever we take our walks, they're all out and want to play with Everest. And but there's also not a lot of kids in my block because it would be considered the gay district in Harrisburg. There's a bar up about a block away from me that is a historic gay bar. And for folks that are familiar with the LGBTQ history, bars in cities were really important for their like safety and community and survival. And in Harrisburg, this is a historic bar, and around that bar, folks who are gay live. And one of the results of that has been a neighborhood that over time has a very high density of LGBTQ individuals and partners, not a lot of kids.
Right.
And so it's not like you would go on the cul-de-sac or the suburbs and see, all the kids come out and play, and you do like, hockey on the street, stuff like that. It's not like that. Now Midtown is, Allison Hill is, but not downtown. It's also a corporate area. So that creates a different vibe, right? After 5. Like when things are in session, when the house is in session, when it's not. It's fascinating. So things for me have been really getting to know the names of my neighbors, caring for them as I can, and then also setting boundaries. Like I literally cannot respond or touch the needs of my neighbors. They're so great and so big. So there's only so much I can do. And that in and of itself is a podcast, right? But it's like, you start to engage the complexities of any person, of any neighbor, and you realize even yourself, right? And you realize these things go on and on and on, and it doesn't end. So that's been a humbling lesson. But as a church, there's so many things. Well, the other thing too is I had the privilege of working with Jewish Family Services, refugee resettlement. And so in the building beside where my office is, I have 2 apartments above, and 2 guys from Afghanistan were with me for 5 months. And it was phenomenal to see that experience. Really, it was an amazing success story. These guys got jobs right away and were able to move into permanent housing. And now that when they pop over, one of them has a car. Like it's great to see that in very quick amount of time. The other apartment was a really difficult story. I inherited that apartment with a single mom with 3 kids. She lost her job during COVID. She's 21. I had a 4th on the way, and was unable to pay rent. And after 6 months trying to get services aligned, and realizing the issues that she was dealing with in her life, she was unable to actually get to take it, to take the step to get enrolled in the services that were there to help her. And so she ended up moving in with a boyfriend and leaving. But we had to go through the whole process of eviction and all of that. Really hard. So, it's messy, and it doesn't always turn out great, but I think I made the commitment to be close to my rental units. I'm not hiring like a property management company, like that just deals with the business side of things, right? I'm physically there. Like it's me who's talking to them and living beside them. I'm literally neighboring them.
Yeah.
So it's different in that sense. Yeah. HBIC though, as a congregation, we're doing ESL courses, citizenship courses, food pantries, all the social service things that you would expect, medical missions, in addition to racial reconciliation classes, diversity classes. Like it's a hop in place. We're in an old car dealership, like a Saab dealership. So you park on the roof. You don't even look like, it doesn't even look like a church, right? And we're in a section called Allison Hill. So we're up on Derry Street. Interesting place.
Yeah. Wow. I think about all those social programs and things like that HBIC is running. And that's not where Marsh Creek is, right? Where I am, Marsh Creek Community Church. Right now, we just started up some family playtime. So this thing called Book Buddies that happens on Tuesdays. It's an hour. Parents can come and bring their little kids, and there's time to just play, do some crafts, have some story time, of course. But then they take off, and then the next day we have called a play cafe, which is parents come and again bring their kids and some free play and coffee and snacks for the grown-ups and stuff. And they've only been going for a little while, but they seem to have struck a nerve. Like it's really something. Like we've had tons of families starting to come to this thing. Tons for our church size, right? We're not a huge church, and so we don't have a ton of capacity to offer a lot of the things that like a Harrisburg BIC might or something. But we're doing what we can at this moment. And it does seem to like they're all coming from the local neighborhoods to come to this thing. A lot of them walk to the church to attend these things. So some come from a little further away, but it's a pretty local thing. And I take encouragement in that, one, just because there are some things that are actually happening that are cool and are bringing people, and that's great. So that's great to see. But it looks very different from some of like citizenship work, and things like that. That's not, we can't offer that right now. But what it looks like to neighbor for us right now at this moment in time are these programs, these little things that we're doing that are simple to run, don't require much budget or people or volunteers, but they can reach our people in a way that some of our people have felt the need for, and so we started it, and apparently others were feeling the need as well. So yeah, it's a very different sort of thing, and I think that can be encouraging, right? Because Scott's, Refton, BIC, you're going to be doing different things out there, than even the stuff that Harrisburg's doing, or than what we're doing. But you're going to need to, right? And we can't all copy each other because we're all different churches at different spaces, to bring back the word that you brought up earlier, Chad.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's this interesting like relationship that we have to have with our neighborhoods. Project 250 is trying to help us understand the changing demographic realities of our neighborhoods. Like our neighborhoods are changing around us, and we have to like track with that, right? It's important to know that. And so at one level, it's really important to know, even where, things like diversity or cultural diversity might be different in Lancaster, there are migrant workers that are coming through in seasonal kind of waves, right? There is, I'm sure, sex trafficking. There's lots of drug situations and things like that with kids. There's all kinds of things that are social issues. It's just different and at different densities. Things tend to hit cities in kind of a higher density first because of the sheer number and volume of people and the intersections of them. Waves of those things like filter out, but that doesn't mean that the issues aren't shared across our respective contexts. I think the other thing, so we need to be aware of them, and I think the other part is that we also need to be prophetic and imagine something different. So this leans in a little bit to the challenge that I would have of, some folks saying like, look, we want to just simply, if we are a church, I'll just use Harrisburg, for instance, and these are real examples, small, like, because of what's called white flight in urban contexts. There was a time when white people moved, out of the city, because inner cities were getting populated increasingly with a labor force that were of folks of color, and immigrant groups. And so white folks moved out, but they kept their churches. And so they would continue to come back into these gigantic urban city churches. And the population of these congregations might be 20, 25 people, all white people, surrounded by a primarily black neighborhood. And you got to ask yourself a question of like, okay, like, you're sitting on a priceless building, it was probably built in no small part due to slavery. And you are a primarily white group, right? Surrounded by a demographic community that does not at all reflect who you are. That's interesting, right? And as a result, many churches have closed. Urban churches across the board have not been able to be responsive to the changing demographic realities around them because they haven't changed over time. And so they've closed.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, but it's not enough to say, okay, so we are changing and now we're just trying to like mirror, right? Like the neighborhood I'm in might be, 80% white, 10% black, 10% Latino, and think something like that, right? And so we want our church to reflect that. I'm like, okay, maybe start there, but that's certainly not an end, right? Merely reflecting the demographic realities of our communities fails to understand the systems and structures that have created those places and why those realities exist to begin with. So you might unintendedly be participating or complicit in systematic oppression because of these invisible forces that are creating your neighborhoods.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole lot of jargon right there, but
Yeah.
like, there's a lot of stuff in it, right? So
I'm tracking.
So I think what I'm after here in the prophetic imagination bit is, this is a take from Walter Brueggemann. Hey, if the Spirit is in us, we're called to, on earth as it is in heaven, right? Be on earth as it is in heaven. And so if we have this imagination of what heaven is like, wow, shouldn't we be creatively expressing that this side of heaven? Not just mirroring the status quo of whatever systems are creating our neighborhoods and being content with that and like patting ourselves on the back because we've, done something different. And so I know I'm talking abstractly, but here's a real practical thing. It could be as simple as encouraging people in the congregation to adopt a foreign exchange student and start to get to know a student from another country and have them change your kind of cultural experience at home with your kids and learn about another place because you have a student that you're hosting and caring for literally in lieu of their parents. And you're starting to learn in that way. It's a very intimate, hospitable way to like bring them to experience your community and have them learn, but also be sensitive to like, they're not like the sole representation from their country, right? Like it's unfair to ask them to speak for the entire country of but I think that's one small step. A little bit more radical step, adopt. Like start adopting people who really need homes and don't have parents. And I'll guarantee you that's going to change your life and it will change your church.
Scott can speak to that.
Yeah.
Those are things that are really, really critical and powerful and profound. But when you start to do those things, it will change your life. It will change the congregation's life. And it could very well change your entire community. If you think about the history of Chinatowns in places like New York City and Philly, that just didn't happen. Like there's a reason why these ethnic communities have come up over time. And a lot of that has to do with settlements, and families bringing families and growing and making a neighborhood. Those things can happen too. Brick World Missions, bring missionaries to your church, bring them into your homes, work with missionaries and work with other groups, MDS on asylum seekers, work with the SALT program with MDS, host people.
MDS.
Mennonite Disaster Service. Sorry, a lot of alphabet soup here with the BIC.
Yeah.
But there's really great programs that can help you diversify not only your home and your experiences, but also your neighborhood.
Chad, I'm wondering, you touched on this earlier in the episode. I'm wondering if you could speak more to kind of those boundaries that you had talked about, like, on an individual level and on a church level, we can't do all of these things. So how do you know? Like, how do you know when too much is too much?
Yeah. Well, for me personally, it might not be the best way, but I try to be self-aware of my energy. And for lack of a better measure, I tend to think about things in terms of what is life-giving and what is life-taking. What's putting me on a trajectory of life, and what is like sucking life out of me and is like heading on the direction of death. And so when I gauge my encounters with my neighbors and I'm starting to get drained, and my neighbors are distractions, my neighbors are irritations, those kinds of things, I need to press pause. And when I'm in a place where my engagements with my neighbors are life-giving in a sense to me and to them, when they are I'm kind of doing it when I have with the energy that I'm fully attentive and there and able to empathize well, I'll engage. But I know this is like kind of vague, but in my own personal world, it's not easy. It's more of a art than a science. There's not like a formula that I'm following here. And it's really day to day, season to season. There could be one day where I might get multiple texts from my neighbor who's a widow, and I just simply can't respond. Like, I just cannot keep up with them all. And then there's other days where I will call her back, where I will text her, and I don't know if it's right or what, but like, does that make sense? Like, just being really real. And I think parents could relate to this too, of sometimes your kids are annoying.
No.
Sometimes you need a break, right? And it's not good for you to engage them when you're in the wrong state, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that there's some parallels there for anybody that wants to get real. Like, you have that with your partner at home, you've got that with your kids, you've got that with your family, you got that with your neighbors. And all of this has to do, I think, with developing the capacity for, I talk a little bit about it, the fruits of the spirit. When something is like bumping me, what's in me, like a glass, is shaking, what's in me comes out. So if I'm filled with the fruits of the spirit and I get bumped, that's going to come out. And that's when I think it's life-giving. If I'm filled with things that are not at the antithetical of that, and I get bumped, I need to it's like a toxic spill. I can't let that come out of my neighbors or the people around me. So a lot of it has to be those practices that what is in you and what is giving life to you and to others. You got to know when to when it's right.
Yeah. So that's why things like Sabbath rest are so important.
Critical.
For your own health and for everybody else.
Yeah.
It just strikes me. It just strikes me though, like we've got 3 different churches that we're involved with, very different. Some are small, some are large, and that number one, while we kind of breezed over it, the start where you are, that's so key, because God put us in that place for a reason. It's not like, oh, well, we don't have this ministry and that ministry and that this other church has. And it's, well, no, wait a minute. You're here in this little spot in this neighborhood, whatever, for a reason. So what can we do here? Start where you are. Don't do, more than you're able. Do a few things well.
Right.
And to be honest, here at Refton, we're still figuring that out. I think, we it's not like we don't do anything. I just think it's one of those things that will always be on the forefront of your mind.
Yeah.
Because something that's really life-giving and God using us in the community, this year may not look the same 5-10 years from now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So there's continual awareness and change and growth.
Yeah. That's huge, Scott, because I there's so many churches who will have these programs, like legacy programs, these ministry things that they do, and we can't stop doing it because we've been doing it for 23 years, and this person started it, and their son is now leading it, and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, yeah, but 2 people are coming, and it's taking up X amount in our budget, and like, you don't want to be like making decisions just based on strictly logistics and budget, things, but at the same time, like, maybe God is calling this church to minister to our community in a different way. The things that we do, the services that the HBIC is offering right now, and that we're doing, and Scott, you guys at Refton, God's calling us to do those things right now, and that's really all we know. And so keep asking your people at the church, like, what are we called to do? Where's the heart of the collective church shifting and forming as time goes on?
Yeah. Some people talk about that as being present, and I think that Sabbath can help us do that. Prayer can help us do the spiritual disciplines can help us be present, and really on like some philosophical existential way, like time is something we made up anyway. Like this idea of past, present, and future, like I think the past and the present, the past and the future is kind of in the present. Like there's a dimension of, if you are present and are intentional about that, you're aware of, hey, I need to practice resurrection. Like, I need to like practice these things that historically happened, but like that's also part of our moment right now. So if we constantly look back to the ancient Bible stories of 2,000 years ago, we miss the whole point of like the Spirit at work in our engagement with our neighbor right now, as well as kind of an eschatological view of the future. Like, I'm a Christian, sorry to say, not because of heaven, but because of right now. I'm not a Christian because of going to heaven. I'm a Christian because it is life-giving right now. It's life-changing right now. Like, it has been transformative right now, not in the future, not because of the past, but because of the eternity of the right now, and realizing that, our brothers and sisters, this is something that my senior pastor, Hank Johnson, does really well, because he's actually originally from Liberia, his family, And his kind of African background has helped connect him in a communal way to this deep sense of ancestry. And I think for the body of Christ, it's like, hey, our brothers and sisters and saints that have gone before are all in this right now, right? You know, like there's a dimension that this is not just something, you know, it also reframes death, and it reframes everything else in a really powerful way.
Yeah. Well, when you can only experience the past and the future in the present. So like the future as an abstract concept will always be, you know, somewhere out there. But by the time you get to next week, which is in the future from right now, you're there in the present. So you only actually experience the future in the present, and you can only affect the future by what you do today. We have a saying in recovery: "Don't worry about, you know, tomorrow will take care of itself if you take care of today." Kind of a saying in recovery, and so yeah, the facts of the past, the resurrection of our Christ, the ministry that he had, the teachings that he had, affect us in the present. We experience them and their power in the present, which then affects the future.
That's right. So I mean,
fascinating concept.
The title of this episode will be called "Back to the Future." I'm sorry, I'm super distracted right now.
Love it.
Love it. Just hook me up with the DeLorean any day.
Yeah,
that's great. Have you guys seen pictures of the new DeLorean concept car?
No.
Ooh, look it up.
Okay.
It's good stuff. Paying homage to the past in the present. So anyway, hey, I want to kind of wrap things up here, Chad. One of the things that you say in your post, you say, on one hand, the Great Commandment seems to push us far beyond loving only the neighbors who are physically near us. So there's a component of the Great Commission that pushes us to the ends of the world, right? But then you say, but on the other hand, if everyone is our neighbor, then no one really seems to be. And what I liked about that is that it helps us to get, as we've talked about before, this prophetic imagination. When you get specific, when you have the faces of your actual neighbors, like as I'm looking out, I'm recording from my home right now. As I'm looking out the windows, I can see my neighbors on either side and across the street. When those faces are in my head, my imagination for how I can neighbor them well, all of a sudden gets very concrete. And less abstract than when I think of pray for those in the 1040 window, or you know, the folks out there, the big out there, you know, and it's good. We should be praying for those people, and we should be, you know, like with our brothers and sisters who are serving in Brethren in Christ World Missions, and you know, all this sort of thing, Mennonite Central Committee. Yes, pray for and partner with those people, but form relationships with them so that way there are faces there too. And once faces get attached and you have that more relational connection, neighboring becomes much more of a concrete thing. And all of a sudden, possibilities just start expanding and coming out of the woodwork for how you can do that better.
Yeah, and what I think is super transformative is when you start to see the face of Jesus in your neighbor.
You know, that's like, better. Let's go with what Chad just said.
No, I mean, I think that you're spot on there, man. But it's that sense of when we get into who's in front of you right now, and how does that help us make the connections that we need to really understand neighboring in this really kingdom way. And I would actually say, it as we're coming down to a close here, like, I'd like to encourage people to think about neighboring in 3 different ways.
Yeah.
The first is like neighboring, like in a sense of like our relationship with God, which is completely other and completely above us, right? So there's a relationship that we have there with God, and that's a very special covenantal relationship. And then there's the relationship that we have with the people next door and the people around us, and the systems and the structures of the organizations around us now. And that's what we talked a lot about on this podcast. But there's another part of neighboring, and that's where you start to get into neighboring with yourself. And this is a weird concept a little bit, but for folks that have been on the journey, they'll know what I'm talking about. You start to reflect a little bit on yourself, and you realize that there are things about yourself that you don't even know. And the concept that God knows you better than you know yourself, there are areas of ourselves that we're completely foreign to and that we're estranged from. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I think that in this really interesting way, we would do well to do some exploration of neighboring. And for some people, that means healing and forgiveness that comes through neighboring. Our being in right relationship with God, right relationship with those around us, and also ourselves.
That seems to come from the article references the Matthew 22 passage. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Here it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. Right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think we gloss over that as yourself bit. You know, that's something we could preach on a little more maybe, because like it's a little easier to think about the person next door. But yeah, what if I don't love myself very well?
Yeah.
And separating that out from this like all feel good kind of like culture of like just love yourself and everything's cool, like that kind of thing. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But you know, like what you guys are both saying here just reminds me so much. In recovery, one of the issues I was working on a lot was my anger. I was dealing a lot with anger, and it was starting to bleed over into my relationships with my children when they were younger. And I knew I couldn't keep going down that path, and so I went into recovery. And in doing my if you guys are familiar with recovery work, in the 4-step, you do in your inventory, and you just write down everything, just everything in your life that you have done and that others have done. Do you know all this kind of stuff? Through all the work of recovery, I came to see how I was bullied a lot in junior high and high school, and that effect that shaped me a lot in terms of how I felt about respect that I deserved and the way other people treat me. I was highly sensitized to all those things. And so the anger and bitterness that had been sitting dormant in me for years started coming out when I had kids. And I had no idea until I was starting doing all this work that my experience in junior high and high school was directly affecting my parenting, me being a father. And it didn't make any sense to how in the world are those two things connected, but it made perfect sense when I saw it in an arc, and I looked at my life overall and how things were being affected. And I think, Chad, that goes back to a little bit about in that first step, start with where you are, but also understand the history of your neighborhood, of your people, how things got to be they were. Understanding my history when you talk about neighboring yourself. Yeah, also understand your own history. Go back and look at it, because understanding all of that helped me understand my now to make the changes that I need to make now so that I could be a better father in the now and in the future. So it makes a lot of sense as you talk about neighboring yourself. Gosh, that works on a lot of levels, man. That's cool.
Yeah, I think you just connected some serious dots there, right? Like, I mean, that's I think a really important part of thinking at a multi-level way of approaching this. Yeah.
All right, guys, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. If people are still with us, thanks for hanging out with us for this long. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm super, super glad, Chad, that you could join us today. Chad, can you just take 1 minute here and tell us about the event that's coming up? You had mentioned it at the very beginning, but the neighboring event that's coming up it's at Messiah, yes?
Yeah. So at Messiah University on April 20th, 2023, this year.
So just a few weeks after this episode comes out.
Yeah. So for those of you in the future that are looking back on human watching this podcast, this happened. The convening, it's a convening on housing and neighboring. And the whole intention is to bring people from the communities or community leaders, mayors, these would be nonprofit folks, faith leaders, higher ed folks, just a whole fundraiser, lots of people together to talk about what does neighboring mean, and how is that an important way to address some of the challenges we're facing with affordable housing. So we're trying to tackle this affordable housing monster, and looking at it through the lens of neighboring, and doing that, at least at Messiah, by convening and creating the space and the place for our community partners to start to talk and imagine. It's getting back to that prophetic imagination. It's imagining new ways of approaching this, because our old ways just aren't working. So we're actually trying to work this out. There'll be a lot of folks there that are not brethren in Christ and that are not Christians, but the language of neighboring is a way to kind of back into this really rich model that Jesus has put out in front of us to love God, love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So that's the 20th.
So if you get a chance, definitely check that out. We'll put there's a link to that, right?
I'll send you a link. We could put it in the description, or
so we'll put it in the show notes, and even if it's something like, let's say you're not from the Harrisburg area necessarily, but for some reason you can make it to this or whatever, it sounds like something that you could at least learn or at least observe. Hey, this is something that this group of people, this geographic area is doing. Maybe this is something that I could bring back in some respects back to where I live and in my context, who are the community leaders we can get together with to talk about a particular issue that seems to be really plaguing our immediate context and culture where we live, maybe.
That's exactly right.
Sounds like something we could really learn from. So Chad, if people wanted to reach out to you, talk to you more about this, how can they do that?
Yeah, so my email is cfrey, Frey, @messiah.edu.
Awesome.
So that's how you can reach me. And to Ryan's point, there's dimensions of this convening that are virtual. So wherever you are, you could pop on virtually. There are videos that are up and resources that are up on the website, messiahconnection.org. And you can check that out too. So
awesome.
Yeah, feel free to, anybody that wants to jump into the deep end of the theological pool anytime, I would love to have a little swim.
Excellent. Sounds like you and Chad could nerd out for quite a while. Scott is our resident theologian here.
Love it.
I'm just along for the ride. So, all right, Scott, you good?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chad. Really appreciate the conversation and the insights.
Yeah. It was really practical stuff. Really good stuff. So we'll have the link to the post in the show notes and all the other stuff. Everyone, thanks for joining us on the BIC Life Podcast. If you have any questions or topics that you'd like to explore, that you'd like to see us explore, you can reach out to us at biclifepodcast@gmail.com. Submit any questions, comments. We'd love to hear from you. biclifepodcast@gmail.com. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Thanks for listening to the BIC Life Podcast. Brethren in Christ churches exist to follow Jesus, serve others, and make disciples. If you're looking for more information about the BIC denomination, or if you're looking for one of our local churches, head over to bicus.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us at the podcast, you can do so by emailing us at biclifepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.